minute or two. It's time for the final session, and it's a policy session. I guess the format is similar to the previous sessions anyway. It's based on the paper that will be briefly presented by Lionel and Philippe, and there are two commentators, but a bit more time for discussion afterwards. And the general idea here is to talk about and try to understand how we in Europe have been affected by the increase in energy prices. So the paper is based on evidence from France before the big surge in prices. But please, you have 30 minutes jointly.
Thank you for this introduction and thank you for having us. So this is joint presentation with Philippe and a joint paper with Philippe and Gianluca Orefice, who is not there today. So somehow the paper is also about geoeconomics, which is the topic today. So we think of the impact of sanctions and sanctions on energy, and the way sanctions on energy have somehow affected the countries imposing the sanctions, which is interesting per se. And we try to have some microeconomic evidence on the adjustment of firms and draw some aggregate, conclusions on the mechanisms that have led to the adjustment that we have seen. So we start from the micro and we try to go to the broad picture. So I understand that we didn't see the slides on the web or something like this. Okay, thank you very much. So let's start. So the motivation, as I said, is about this potential embargo. So the actual total embargo did not fully take place, but still we had a huge reduction in imports of oil and the more so for gas. And so what is interesting is the way this has been envisaged in the policy debate. So at the beginning, people were totally scared, and in particular in Germany. So there is here a quote of the German Chancellor in March 2022, which is really something telling us that we are on the brink of a disaster. And I have to move a bit. The second quote, like 1 year later, is telling us something different. So the mood is different. It's much more calm because people understand that at the end of the day, firms manage to adjust, to cope with this shock. And so the mood was to say that the German industry at the end of the day was very resilient. So this is this change that we would like to shed light on. And so since we are in Paris, we took the French example because we had access to the French data. And so if you take the French example, and if you consider the end of 2020 and the end of 2022, so the price of electricity has basically doubled, and the price of gas has basically tripled. And so you may expect that the manufacturing production in France would have dropped dramatically. And actually, this is not what happened because it slightly increased. And so there is no causation there, but there is a puzzle. And so the purpose of this presentation is to address this puzzle. So how is it that French firms adjusted to this shock? So we don't have, data for this very recent period at the level of detail that I'm mentioning, but we have data for a long period starting in 1995 until 2019. And this is the period that we will exploit. And as you will see, we have during this period also peaks of prices that can be exploited. So what are the channels that we as economists could figure out? So the first one is that if there is a price increase, so the demand for energy will decrease. Then there is a second adjustment, which is maybe more interesting, which is the fact that due to this price signal, firms will adjust and increase their energy efficiency by the ways that we will discover later on. Then firms will have to pass, to their consumers the increase in the cost. So there is an issue of pass-through. And since firms will increase their prices at the end of the day, then the demand will fall for their products, and then output will fall, employment will fall. And all this is very clear, but there are two more channels that are interesting to look at. The first one is that within firm, you can have relocation of production across plants, because not all plants are as energy effective. And last but not least, firm can simply replace imports of energy-intensive intermediate products by imports of energy-intensive intermediate products to their actual production. And so this is something that has been very well documented. For instance, for ammoniac, we have anecdotal evidence that it happened for ammoniac. So what we find in this paper is that all these channels are there, and we quantify these channels. So we find that there is a substantial reduction in energy demand. We find that there is an increase in energy efficiency. We find a pass-through of 100%, which is very much in line with what Isabelle, Julien, and Raphaël find in a different paper with similar data. We find a drop in output, in employment, and we observe this relocation between plants because we observe consumption of energy at the plant level. So we observe this at the plant level, and then we can aggregate at the firm level, and so we can see what is the relocation between plants. And we also observe the import of energy-intensive intermediate products that I was just mentioning. And what is quite interesting is to see that if you consider the largest shocks in terms of price shocks, then the demand is different. The demand elasticity will be lower. And then if you consider the end of the period, and this is also something which is important because then we are close to the shock at the end of the period that we are considering there. At the end of the period, the sensitivity of firms to the price shock is lower. So which we interpret as the fact that firms have increased their, their energy efficiency by dropping less efficient plants, and it could be also less good news, and this would be a selection of firms with the most energy-intensive firms disappearing. So in the interest of time, I skip the literature. So the context that we use, and we can discuss this afterwards, is quite interesting because this is true for the gas market and this is true for the electricity market. In France, we have had several changes in the regulation over the period that we are considering. And so firms can have different contracts, different plants within the same firm can have different contracts, and contracts are renegotiated regularly, like every 2 years, but not systematically, at the same date for all firms. So we have, price changes for the different firms or even for the different plants which are uncorrelated, which helps, for the identification. So how do we proceed? So we proceed with standard diff-in-diff. And so we observe the price of electricity or the price of gas, as I said, at the plant level, and then it means also at the firm level. And so from this, we can draw evidence on the demand elasticity, the response of employment, the response of the energy efficiency, and we can observe this cross-plant subsidiarity that I was mentioning before. So we do something which is simple. So this is a within identification with firm fixed effects. So the firm fixed effects are there to control for, you know, the size of the firm, the energy intensity of the firm, etc., etc. And so we also have sectorial fixed effects systematically. Why so? Just because we want to control for any, you know, time-varying shock that would occur in a given sector and that would affect all firms of a given sector at the same time, which is in particular important because with this we control for, you know, the change in the price of energy, which is common to all firms within the same sector. Okay, so this is the type of identification that we have. And as I said, the French institutional and contractual setting is limiting the endogeneity concern. Okay, so the baseline equation is like this. So Y is the outcome. So this is the outcome of firm F in sector S in year T. And so we have the variable of interest, which is the price of electricity or the price of gas for firm F in sector S and time T. We have the firm fixed effect and we have the sector time fixed effect. So the price of electricity is not the actual price that you would see on the invoice. This is, you know, the bill that is paid for electricity by the firm within a year divided by the quantity which is consumed, and the same for gas. So we have firm fixed effect, we have sector time fixed effect. So you may say, well, we are on the safe side regarding exogeneity. Indeed, this is not the case. We still have a big endogeneity concern, which is the fact that, you know, you have scaling up firms that can negotiate lower price. So the idea is very simple. So the firm sales increase, the demand for energy will increase, and so the price will decrease. And so you may wrongly interpret this as a negative relationship between the two. So in order to correct for this, we have three strategies. One is to use a lagged price. The price of energy is like 1 year. One is to use an IV, and one, which is just there for robustness, is to use firm period fixed effect with period of 3 years. As for the IV, so we adopt a rather simple strategy. So we have a shift share or kind of Bartik instrument. So the first thing that you have to look at is the term which is in square bracket. So the term in square bracket is what? This is the gap in the energy price between the firm that you actually observe, which is F, in the initial year, which is T0, gap vis-à-vis the rest of the firms within the same sector S at the initial year also. So in this average at the denominator, you drop the firm that you actually observe, okay? For reasons that are totally obvious. So this is the term that you use, and then you interact this with the change in the price or the actual price that you observe at each date for the average of the sector S, excluding again this firm, okay? So this is the Bartik instrument that we use. And the instrument, as you will see with Philippe, is working kind of nicely. So now on the data that we use, I won't be too long on this. So the first data that we use is the survey, which is conducted by the French National Institute, INSEE, on the consumption of energy and other intermediate products, but the consumption of energy by French firms. So you have gas, electricity, oil, coal, but mostly gas and electricity. And what is important for us is that indeed all firms use electricity, but not all firms use gas. And so we will treat separately gas and electricity. And so importantly, this survey has the identifier of the firm, meaning that we can merge with the balance sheet. So you know the French data probably, so this is ficus phare. And there we have the value added, the number of workers, etc., etc. And we can also match with the same firm identifier with the French customs in order to have the export value, the quantity, and then to derive from this the unit values and then kind of proxy of the export price of the firms. So this is what we do. And I leave the floor to Philippe. He will give you some descriptive stats and then the results.
Okay, so thanks. So very quickly, the two important numbers here is basically the gas dependency and electricity dependency. So that's the share of cost in manufacturing in French firms on electricity and gas. So first thing is, these are not huge numbers. They are not very large, around 2.5% or 1.7% for gas. That's an average. Of course, there's quite a lot of heterogeneity across manufacturing firms. What you also see, and this is going to be important for some of the results, is that during this period, if anything, there was a trend on electricity prices, also on gas prices that was going up during the whole period. That's even more true for gas prices. But what is important is that there's this average trend, but what we are going to use and exploit is the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity across firms because of institutional framework in France that has changed a lot, because of contracts that change, and basically some firms are lucky because when they renegotiate their contract, it happens at a good time or at a bad time. And we're going to see that there's a lot of heterogeneity in these price shocks, which is what we're going to exploit. Okay, so that's the distribution. And so you see that for electricity, basically all manufacturing firms use electricity for one more or less, of course, but for gas, of course, some of them don't, almost don't use. So basically, this is the share of total cost, which is, in this case, electricity cost, okay? Because remember, we have the wage cost, we have the input cost. We don't have, the only thing we don't have is financial costs, okay? So it's only part of the cost. Okay, so let me start with, so the richness of the data is enabling us to identify the different channels through which firms can adjust to this energy price shocks. And that's the value added of the contribution of the paper. And as Lionel said, there are many channels, but in some sense, the most natural, the first channel we can think of is that firms are going to try to decrease as much as possible their demand for electricity and gas. As Lionel said, we are concerned, of course, with endogeneity. So what we do is these different ways to alleviate these concerns. Especially the main concern is basically a firm expects a positive demand shock, renegotiates the contract and lowers the price of energy with the producer. So the way we're going to try to alleviate this reverse causality concern is to basically either lag or use the IV, as Lionel was saying. So these are basically the elasticities you should focus on. We have the OLS, but in some sense, I think it's clearly too large. And basically what we get is an elasticity of demand, which is around minus 0.4, minus 0.5. So that's pretty large, but in a sense, that's kind of similar to the other studies at the firm level or at the aggregate level. So we are reassured that this is basically a number that makes sense. So first message is firms react in the year quickly and strongly to a price shock. Numbers, the regression 3 is interesting also because here we control for production of the firm in a year, because clearly, and this is echoing some of the debates we had during this year, is yes, we see a fall in the demand for energy, but it's maybe because simply firms are completely are decreasing strongly their production. When we control for production, yes, you see the elasticity falls, but not that much. So of course, yes, demand for electricity falls if production falls, but mostly it's coming not from a fall in production, which in some sense is good news. It does not mean that production is not going to fall. It is going to fall, but most of the demand fall is not coming from production. When we do it for gas, and by the way, I think it's interesting to distinguish electricity and gas, because in the present crisis, clearly, the two aspects were very important, and particularly because the initial shock was gas. Again, if we come back to the problem of the war, it was gas, and then electricity prices. So for gas, we have much larger elasticities, around -1. These are very large, and they are kind of surprising, in a sense maybe too large, but we've tried to look at as much as possible. Again, you see that, and this is also the same thing for when we instrument the price of gas. Again, we also find that yes, production, the value production of the firm has an impact on its demand for gas, but still most of the price elasticity remains the same whether you control or not for production. One thing which is important, of course, in view of the motivation of this paper, which is the present crisis, is that you should be concerned by saying, well, yeah, but these price shocks are small, and we know that the price shock that we've experienced is large. The nice thing is that in our data, actually, we do observe big price shocks at the firm level, okay, or at the plant level. Okay, so when we look at the largest positive price shocks, okay, so this is the largest quartile, okay, so the 25% largest price increase at the firm level in all the observations we have, okay. So what you see is that the average of these largest shocks is around 36% for electricity and 53% for gas, okay. So these are pretty big shocks at the firm level, okay. In the present crisis, depending on how you look, but basically between 2019, the average of 2019-21 was, and 22 was, I think, around the same number for electricity. For gas, it's true, it's larger, it's around 80%. But still, I think that means that we're not completely out of it, okay? So what you see is that in this case, and that I think is an interesting message, is that, remember, the average is 0.4, 0.5. When you look at the largest price shocks, it's smaller, 0.2. In a sense, I think that you would have guessed it, that, you know, when you have a large, very large shocks, maybe the elasticity is not linear, and it's harder to decrease as much your production for larger than a small shock. And that's the same thing for gas. The second question we ask is, yes, but maybe, remember the data is on 95, 2019, that maybe the elasticity, the price elasticity has changed over time. And so what we do for both gas and electricity is to have interaction terms with periods. So what you see here is that indeed, at the end of the period, in some sense, the one that is most relevant for the present crisis, 2012, 2019, if anything, again, especially for gas, here, the elasticity is also smaller, okay? One way to interpret it, and what we don't have, you know, it's an interpretation, is that indeed, you know, firms that were the most costly in terms of, or inefficient in terms of energy use have disappeared or have adapted, and it's become harder to adapt to a price shock. In some sense, they have made all the effort. That's one interpretation. There may be some others, but anyway, and because remember, during this whole period, prices were increasing. Clearly, were increasing pretty big. Okay. What? Some of them, yes, in the first period, yeah. Yeah, but basically around -1, okay. And if you look at the standard error, you'll basically
the positive, negative.
Yeah, and there are some positive. Yeah, remember also that here in these slides, I'm looking only at positive shocks because we have some positives and some negative. And here clearly you see that for electricity. So for example, here it's for the positive that it is more than 1, but not much more than 1 anyway. Okay, so the second, so these are, this is the first channel of adjustment, simply trying to reduce your demand for energy. The second one is basically you have a cost shock, you try to increase your prices. Okay, so how much of the cost shock is passed through into prices? So we don't have the domestic prices, but actually in the paper that Julien Martin, Isabelle Méjean are writing or have written, they have the domestic prices. We have the export prices. So in some sense, we take export prices of these firms as a proxy of production prices. And so what you see is that basically, remember that for electricity, the cost share of total cost of electricity cost as a total cost is around 4%. So what it says is that basically when you have a 10% increase in electricity prices, you increase your export prices by around 0.4%. Okay, so more or less it means that the pass-through is 100%. Okay, and this is true also for gas prices. This is again something that they find. So it's good. It's going to be good news for the firm because clearly that means that in terms of the profits, it's going to lower the impact on profits. It's not good news for macro inflation dynamics because what that means is that basically it goes through the supply chain. Okay. Now, when you look at export quantities, what you find is that indeed there's a negative impact on competitiveness. It's consistent actually with what we know about elasticities at the international level. So basically here you see that if you have a 10% increase in electricity prices, you increase your export prices by 0.4, and with an elasticity of around 5, which is more or less what trade economists tell us is the trade elasticity, that would mean a 2% fall in your exports. So pretty big. So here it's important it's a pretty big impact on competitiveness. Energy prices have a pretty large impact on competitiveness, and the same thing more or less for gas. Okay, now let's look at production, employment, etc. Again, pretty large. Okay, pretty large impact in the sense that here you see that a 10% increase in electricity prices decreases employment by around 1.5%, and the same thing for production. When we use lagged prices, you see there's zero effect for gas prices. But actually, let me show you immediately that when you do the IV, actually these things are significant, and more or less for employment and production, you find the same thing. But these are relatively large impacts. So from that point of view. In terms of energy efficiency, you see that when you use lag prices, we only find a positive. So energy efficiency is value added per kilowatt. Okay, and we see that there's a positive impact here. And on profits, we find only for electricity, not for gas. But actually, when we distinguish between those firms that are the most dependent on gas, we do find a negative impact on profits, but relatively small and not big. And in a sense, the fact that it's relatively small, it's there, comes from the addition of all these channels of adjustment. The message is here that there are lots of channels of adjustment in the year, and therefore we should not be surprised that the impact on profits at the end is not huge. It's either small, not significant, or when it is significant, it's for those firms that are the most dependent on energy. One thing that is interesting is that we have firms that we have plant and firm level data, and so we have some firms that have several plants in France, and so what we can observe is what happens when the firm price of energy increases, but not in all plants. And do firms, in some sense, substitute energy demand from one plant to another in reaction to an increase in price? And what we see is that this is the case. What firms do is that if in one plant, basically, the price of energy increases because of the contract becomes more expensive, they relocate. Here we have evidence on the demand for electricity and for the demand on gas, they do relocate their demand of electricity or gas towards the plant that is that has a lower price, or is maybe more effective or more efficient in terms of its use of gas. Now, this is not the stories that we've heard, which was delocation outside of Europe. It's only inside France, but in some sense, I think it's suggestive that firms find a way to relocate some of their production. Now, another story that we've heard quite a bit during the crisis is firms have stopped producing locally some of the intermediate inputs and started importing some of the most energy intensive intermediate inputs. So what you see, so here the evidence is mixed. We do find it for intermediate imports, not for total imports. Maybe total imports is just too large, but we do find it for intermediate imports, but only for electricity. Okay, so maybe we have to look a bit harder. So there's some partial evidence that indeed firms substitute intermediate imports to local production. Okay, so let me end with some slides which are basically still preliminary work, and it's not completely finished. So one question, obviously, that I'm sure you have is to what extent this French firm level data from 95 to 2019 give us some idea of what were the mechanisms of adjustment. Okay, so remember the advantage of our data is it's super precise, super rich, firm level or plant level. Okay, so in some sense, it's an identification of the way that firms adjust to price shocks. The concern you might have is that this is not the same, this is not the same period, this is not the same size, etc. So what we try to do is to see to what extent our firm level estimates are consistent with some of the aggregates that we've seen. And we've not done yet. It's very partial in the sense that it's very back of the envelope calculations. But basically, to make a long story short, in particular, if you look at the comparison of the period 2019-21 versus 2022, so in terms of electricity prices, and we can think of that the shock was basically a plus 26% real increase in prices, because during this same period, the price of electricity increased by almost 50%, and the price of manufacturing increased by 21%. During this same period, French manufacturing production decreased by 5%, okay? Employment actually increased by 1.2%. So basically, if we were to take our model seriously, but again, it's not very precise, with this type of shocks, we would have an expected electricity demand that would have fallen by 4%. For the moment, the problem is that we don't have at the aggregate level, the fall of electricity demand for the manufacturing sector. We hope to get it, so I cannot compare to what it is, but at least it doesn't look completely, out of completely irrelevant. And for employment, actually, what the model predicts is -5%, which is basically what we've observed. So I'm not saying that our model predicts what has happened, but at least it's not completely inconsistent. So I think here we're trying to convince you that what we learn at the very micro level from our data may be instructive for what has happened during the crisis. In terms of policy implications, so as you know, there's been a lot of public money that has been spent during the period, and these were short-term policies to absorb to absorb part of the price shock, and the concern was basically employment and production. And to some extent, our paper says yes, the concerns on employment and production are partly valid. So what we do in the paper, and again, this is preliminary, is that we discuss two types of short-term policy options. They are very costly. I remember that for the total of the EU, the total of the absorption of public policies of the price shock were around 220 billion euros. This is both firms and households. So at some point, we'll have to distinguish the two. So there were two types of models, and they're still discussed, and it's an important policy discussion because basically, who knows, you know, maybe in 6 months or in 1 year, we're going to have another big price shock. And so therefore, we need to think about what are the best ways to do this. So in terms of the short-term policy option, so for example, in France, there was a partial absorption of the price increase, but basically for the total firm consumption, okay? And then the second model, it's also linked to the German model, but it's not exactly the same thing, is that basically to leave some room for the price signal to work, what you do is that you absorb part of the price for a fixed consumption level, basically the past consumption, and then you let any extra consumption at the market price, which is super high, okay? In a sense, again, the rationale of the second is you let at least partly the price signal work to incentivize the firms. So the argument in the paper is that the second one is superior, looks superior to one, but actually in the sense that it's a lower fiscal cost for the same price absorption at the firm level, but only if the price elasticity of demand does not decrease too much when you have very large price increases. Because remember that the extra demand is at very high prices. And remember that what we've seen is that actually for very large price increases, demand elasticity is falling. So it's not obvious that the second option is better from a short-term point of view. But the main message of the paper is that firms do find channels to adjust, and therefore the price signal works. And therefore we should, as much as possible, let the price signal work. And so the objective, the policy objective, should really to increase energy efficiency, and it's better to use public. I mean, maybe I'm saying something pretty obvious, but to use public money to increase innovation and energy efficiency and help the transition towards clean energy. This has a further positive effect, which is not without consequence given our results, is that this reduces the cost of energy and therefore increases competitiveness. And remember that actually energy is a big part of competitiveness. It does have an impact on competitiveness. A third and last point is that our results, we think, are related to some of the policy discussions also on the reform of the electricity market in Europe. And here, in some sense, I think we agree with some of the objectives that have been given to this reform, which is basically, indeed, the volatility of energy price shocks for the manufacturing sector in Europe is a problem. And therefore, we should try to reduce this volatility. And one thing that has been in particular put on the table is to have more long-term contracts between energy producers and firms, which for a long time were considered bad because anti-competitive. And in some sense, I think the balance of the trade-off between the competition issues and the reduction of volatility of energy price shocks, I think we are saying that basically we should go towards more smoothing and less volatility of shocks at the firm level, maybe with minimum prices, but that's a discussion we let open. Okay, and just to show you the last graph, in fact it's in the introduction, but in a sense this is the message that energy efficiency does. So this is at the aggregate level, but we hope to convince you this is also true at the firm level. It's relatively amazing to see that when we look at energy efficiency, remember it's value added per kilowatt hour, and when we look at, for example, electricity prices, we do see that indeed French firms seem to react to the prices by increasing energy efficiency. So in terms of public policy, we'd better help in terms of increasing this energy efficiency rather than trying to absorb price shocks. And I'll stop here.
Both of you, and I think I shouldn't stand there. In particular, the policy slide that you had at the end, I think there were a number of interesting things that I certainly wanted to discuss and get back to in terms of how to think about the energy markets. And what you said, I think, goes very much against all the thinking and practice in Sweden. So we have quite a lot of things to talk about. But we will now open up for two sets of remarks. And first is virtually, I hope Julien is, yes, I see your slides at least. I leave the floor to, or the screen to you, Julien. At most 15 minutes to start with.
Okay, thanks a lot. I hope you hear me well. Is it okay?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Philippe and Lionel for this great presentation, and thanks to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. So, okay. So just the general assessment of the paper is that the authors have done a great job to exploring this question. So I think it's an important paper on firms' adjustment to energy prices. And it's very interesting to have both the adjustment to electricity and gas prices. There is an impressive data work. The author managed to combine information, firm level or plant level information on energy consumption, balance sheet, exports. Of course, and this is something that both Lionel and Philippe have emphasized. So the data stop at the end of 2019. But I think they do a pretty good job at convincing us that it's what they find before 2020 or 2021 is also relevant for the energy crisis that we are living. So it's a very careful empirical analysis with many insightful results. So it's very good paper. My takeaway, and I'm happy to see that it was also Philippe's takeaway at the end of the presentation, is really that energy efficiency improves in response to energy price hikes, and I think that's the key message of the paper. So just an overview of my comment. First, it's the title of the paper is about the many channels of adjustments, and because there is many channels, maybe it may help the reader to add some structure, and so this may help navigating through the results. So I would try to propose one structure. We can think of very different structures, but just putting some structure may help in presenting the results. My second comment, or maybe it's more of a question, is basically they are using energy prices. They look at the impact of energy prices. I wonder whether we could look at the impact of energy shocks, and I'll come back on what I mean by energy shock. And last, as I say, the main message is about energy efficiency, and I'll try to push the authors to provide more results on energy efficiency at the end of this discussion. But yeah, so the paper is about estimating elasticities, okay? By how much do firm level outcomes, like many types of outcomes, change following a 1% increase in the price of electricity or in the price of gas. And so there are many outcomes that are explored: the demand for energy, the export prices, employment, value added, energy efficiency, profits, the demand in other plants, the imports. And so you have these many channels, and in the next 4 slides, I will try to present a very simple structure that may help the author to organize the estimates of these different elasticities. And just for simplicity, I will show you the elasticity to electricity price, but of course, a similar structure applies for gas prices or even energy prices in general. So the structure I propose is just an accounting structure. So you could, choose something else, but I think it may help to see some equations and to relate the estimated elasticities to this equation. So the starting point is just this very simple accounting equivalence. That is that profits is just the difference between the value added and the wage bill. And so the elasticity of profits to an increase in electricity prices is just a combination of the elasticity of value added to electricity prices and the elasticity of employment to electricity prices. Okay, so what's the first result of the paper is that there is at most no impact on firms' profits. So an increase in electricity prices has no impact on firms' profits. And so then you can relate that to the other two elasticities, the elasticity of value added and the elasticity of employment, and they find that both are around minus 0.15. And then you may wonder whether it adds up, okay, whether this accounting equality that I show is consistent with the elasticity estimates in the paper. And indeed, if you just look at these two terms here, this one and that one, and you can compute that from the French data, and then you add up the elasticity, the weighted elasticities, and you do find that indeed the two forces compensated. So you have both value added that is decreasing in response to an increase in price elasticity, employment that is decreasing, and the two cancel out. And so at the end of the day, you have no impact on profits. Okay, so now we're going to look at, once you have these elasticities, you can dig into each of the elasticities. So one thing is to look at the elasticity of employment to electricity prices, which is the epsilon L, big LE. So let me erase that. It's useless. So what they estimate is that it's an elasticity of minus 0.15. So what does it? Why would you expect employment to drop in response to an increase in electricity prices? So basically, because you expect that demand for the firm is going to decrease because the price increase. Okay, this is the competitiveness channel that Philippe has emphasized. Do we have some way to test this channel, this competitiveness channel? Of course, they don't have data on domestic production and domestic prices, but they do have this information for exports. And what they find is very consistent with this drop in competitiveness. And so what you observe that you have a drop in employment. Why? Because when prices increase, the export price increase as well. And so the value of export or the quantity exported decreases. And so this has a negative impact on employment. Okay, so we have looked at the elasticity of employment, but we can also dig into this elasticity of value added and also use the estimates to understand what happens for the elasticity of value added. So this is the elasticity that they estimate. You can do more accounting and just express value added as the ratio of as the product of energy efficiency, the value added per kilowatt times the energy usage of the firms. And here again, this allows you to interpret in this framework another elasticity that is estimated, which is the elasticity of energy efficiency to electricity prices. What misses from the estimates that you estimate the elasticity of electricity demand to electricity prices, the elasticity of gas demand to gas prices, but you don't estimate the elasticity of the total energy usage to each of those two prices. So it would be great to report the elasticity of energy usage to electricity prices and to gas prices. You may think that there may have some substitution between the two, and at least you need that if you want to dig into to use the structure that I'm just proposing right now. And last, what they do at the end of the paper is to look at this increase in energy efficiency. And what do they find? They find that there is in response to an increase in prices, in electricity prices, the firms increase their energy efficiency. Why is it so? Because there is some within firm substitution, and because firms start to rely more on importing inputs. Okay, so this is one structure, but this is one way you could kind of rationalize the your result and maybe guide more the reader through the many very super interesting results that you provide in the paper. So this is the first comment. The second comment is about what I call energy shock. Okay, so in the survey that you're using, you have data, firm level data on the change in the price of electricity and in the price of gas. Okay, but you also have information on energy costs, and so to me, the shock that firms face is in fact the combination of the change in the price of electricity or the price of gas, so the change in the energy price, times the exposure of firms to this energy. So if you have a firm that rely a lot on electricity, then a 10% increase in the price of electricity is likely to have a different impact on her adjustment and the different outcome than a firm that face a similar increase in the price of electricity, but for whom the electricity accounts for a very tiny share of inputs. So you know, you have E is the price of electricity. It's very easy to compute the change in the price of electricity times the share of energy that is used by the firm or by the plant. And actually, you do that in some specifications where you have both you introduce both the price of energy and the interaction between the price of energy and the exposure to this energy. My question / suggestion is why don't you use just this interaction, these shocks throughout the paper? I don't have time to enter into the detail, but I think that this could also help, you know, the identification strategy and the IV part of the paper, but we can talk about that later. Okay, so I have 4 minutes and I'm almost done. So as I say, I find that the result on energy efficiency is super important, and maybe it calls for further investigation. You know, the first dimension that I think would be interesting to explore is asymmetry. And particularly when I was reading their paper, I was wondering whether these energy savings are permanent or not. So when you have these price hikes right now, the firms are going to become more efficient. But if the price of electricity and gas decreases next year or in 2 years, will the firm conserve this higher energy efficiency, or will they start again just using energy in a less efficient manner? And I think that's you know, maybe the channels, the fact that you substitute energy by with imports suggests that there is no asymmetry, but you may also think that, you know, the managers and the firms have other strategies to become more energy efficient, and I'm not sure why they would stop being energy efficient once the price of energy decreases. But you know, it's an open question. It's not in the paper yet, so I think it would be interesting to explore. The second dimension is heterogeneity. So in particular, I was wondering whether energy efficiency is more likely to respond to energy prices in some sectors or among firms with some characteristics. And this is related to the policy discussion you have at the end. And you know, we may wonder what sectors or what firms should policy target to help them adjust or improve their energy efficiency in times of price hikes. And the last dimension that I would find interesting to explore is more a quantification of what you find about energy efficiency, and particularly if you think that this energy efficiency is going to persist over time, how much energy will be saved by French firms over the next years, thanks to this adjustment to the energy crisis that we are into. So I'm done with that. So to conclude, it's a great paper. It was also great to discuss like Lionel and Philippe's papers. Yeah, I was kind of back 15 years ago when I was doing my master, and it was the same when you were both presenting. So I would have been very happy to be here. It was not possible, but hope to see you soon. And you know, I've discussed some of the results. There are many more results in the paper, and so I can only recommend everyone to read the paper or the next version of the paper. Thanks a lot.
to Vincent.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity to discuss this very impressive research project on, of course, an extremely important topic at the moment. All right, so we've seen that certain countries had a pretty huge fiscal response to the recent energy crisis. I'm repeating here the quote by Olaf Scholz. By the way, I'm not German, so I'm not going to be here to defend German interests. But what we see is that clearly there was a lot of disagreement in terms of like how big of a risk this actually was. So this is data from Bruegel Institute about fiscal kind of measures and percentage of GDP. So it may be hard to read, but that's on the vertical axis here. Clearly, Germany had this massive intervention. But for instance, if you look at Denmark at the other side of the plot, they had a much smaller intervention. So clearly not everybody had the same idea about how much of a risk of disaster there really was. Okay, so now, of course, there are pros and cons to kind of providing support for firms. Clearly, the most important concern that at least Scholz seemed to have was preservation of jobs or a prevention of a loss of job creation. And one can think also about potential spillover effects, right? One might have been worried that if firms would have been shedding jobs, then this might have created a fall in aggregate demand, which might then have led to further job losses, kind of spiraling into a gigantic recession. So that's sort of the pros potentially. On the cost side, of course, there's the direct fiscal costs and also the fact that you might actually be distorting firms' energy decisions. Now, all these kind of trade-offs, they depend quite directly on what this paper is looking into, is how responsive firms are to changes in energy prices. So that's what makes this paper a very important one. And indeed, we've seen some recent work, including by Moritz, for instance, doing some kind of calculations about welfare costs of this energy crisis and so on. And they all crucially depend on these kind of elasticities of firms' responsiveness. So this is extremely useful work. It's also impressive in terms of the data that these authors have access to. So they combine data on energy use with balance sheet data, and then also a kind of customs data to look at pass-through into prices. They're also lucky that energy prices in France are apparently quite random in terms of contracts and policy changes. So that gives them a great amount of sort of semi-exogenous variation to exploit. And then given the richness of these data, they can look into all these different channels: energy demand, energy efficiency, which is actually I never thought much about. Sort of energy efficiency is really just kind of the equivalent of labor productivity here, value added divided by, in this case, energy rather than labor. They can look into employment effects, value added profits, and so on, and even at pass-through. So it's an extremely rich paper, which provides some very useful numbers for all of us to benefit from. Okay, so here I kind of plugged from the paper some kind of numbers to kind of summarize the effects. And yeah, one of the main findings of the paper is really that firms are really quite responsive. So the elasticity of energy demand for firms is minus 0.4 for electricity, minus 0.9 even for gas. So these are large elasticities. Energy efficiency increases quite a lot. Employment effects are large. I'll come back to that later. Value-added effects are about equally large, so most of the effects on employment on value-added seem to come from employment. And then finally, firm profitability seems to be relatively unaffected given how responsive they can kind of react and how much they can pass through to cost increases to their customers. Okay, so then I'm not going to have time to do justice to all the rich different findings in this paper, changes over times in these elasticities, large versus small shocks, pass-through within firm substitution of plants and so on. So it's an extremely rich paper. Okay, so now back to the policy debates. So here I copied a quote from, I think was towards the end of the paper, that's given the observability of firms here to adapt to energy price shocks through energy efficiency, our main policy recommendation is to limit short-term price absorption by public budget and use public money. So my interpretation of this is just tell policymakers stop burning money on these sort of policies. Now, and in hindsight, that seems quite reasonable in the sense that nowhere we've really seen massive increases in unemployment since the energy crisis. Still, I wanted to kind of raise some reservations. First of all, about the employment effects, clearly that was the main motivation for these policies to worry about these job losses. And the second is about sort of thinking more about sort of the macroeconomic effects that are sort of not really studied in this analysis. So on the first one, I had a quick calculation, which I'm not going to show you because then it's always like just before you present your results. So I swapped two numbers. So let's now give that. So I took from the paper an increase in real electricity prices of 82% and 118% increase in gas prices. Now multiplying that with these elasticities on employment, I actually got to a 20% drop in employment. Maybe I think Philippe was showing 4%. Maybe part of it was that was just for electricity in here. I'm using gas as well, but it seems also I used a different number for the increase in the prices. So there's probably something I might have misunderstood there. But it seems that in any case, these are pretty large numbers. If I multiply that by some numbers on manufacturing employment in France, I got to more than 500,000 job losses. And if I were to kind of extrapolate that to all sectors in the French economy, because of course there's more than manufacturing and other firms are also using energy. So of course this elasticity is going to be different, but if I just sort of extrapolate this, then I got actually to more than 5 million job losses. Again, this is with a lot of caveats that I would definitely trust the author's calculations a lot more than my own. But still, you kind of wonder, if I would have read this paper a year ago when Schultz was making these comments, I might have actually sort of used interpreted the paper as actually supporting those concerns, at least when it comes to the employment effects. All right, so then Philippe had some very nice results to show on large versus small shocks. Now, for the employment effect, it didn't seem like it mattered too much whether we look at large shocks or small shocks. So it doesn't seem that these employment concerns are sort of less important for large shocks than they are for small shocks. And if anything, these elasticities might be slightly larger, but I'm not 100% sure. They seem roughly in the same ballpark. Okay, so then the second sort of set of comments has more to do with sort of macro effects. I think there's some, obviously this is a micro study, so, and they ask the macroeconomists to discuss it, so you can get some of these comments. And most of these, they can of course not be addressed. But I think in future research, some of these sort of more macro numbers could be quite easy to produce based on this sort of analysis. The first would be about the covariance between size or energy use and these elasticities. Of course, these elasticities are going to be heterogeneous across firms. And it would be interesting to see how they covary with size and with use, because that's obviously important for aggregates, not just sort of the average elasticity among sort of all firms, but also whether the big firms respond more than small firms or the other way around. One example that came to mind was this Dunkirk aluminium smelter. I'm not an expert on aluminium at all, but what I've been told is that these smelters, they tend to use the same amount of energy as a mid-sized city. And part of it was kind of mothballed during the last year, and I think they now restarted it again. But obviously, this is a massive energy user. At the same time, they probably don't employ too many people. So if we kind of think about sort of the macro effects, we kind of want to, I think about sort of what some of these big users are doing, and this probably changes kind of the weighted aggregate elasticity relative to sort of just the unconditional elasticity across firms. And then obviously, and this of course goes much beyond the scope of the papers, think about general equilibrium effects. Maybe part of what Scholz was thinking was that this could just spiral, a snowball into a massive recession. Whether these effects in equilibrium will be amplified or dampened is actually not so clear. Well, maybe from what we've seen, it seems that it's probably dampened things because unemployment hasn't increased that much in most countries. But one could easily write down models in which sort of these in which these kind of shocks kind of are amplified. Think about real business cycle, heterogeneous agent, multi-sector models. On the other hand, you could also think of dampening channels that would be there. For instance, in certain sticky price models in which this sort of pass-through to consumers is dampened by the fact that prices don't adjust by all that much. So the final thing I wanted to do is to think about sort of, okay, let's have a quick look at so what has been the effects in a very sort of rough way of these policies. So here again, I'm plotting the Bruegel data on the size of the fiscal intervention. And here is the change in the unemployment rate between February 22 and 23. And it does actually seem like there's a bit of a negative relation. So if we take the two extremes, so Germany with their massive intervention had a small decline in unemployment, whereas Denmark with the smallest intervention had the largest one. Now, how strong this relation is, one can probably argue about, but there does seem to be some effects of these policies. So I think sort of for a more sort of full-blown evaluation of sort of what are the costs and benefits of these policies, one probably need to think a little bit more about sort of these macro effects as well. Although I would certainly agree with sort of the author's overall kind of policy recommendations that one probably wants to be careful in the future, kind of repeating these sort of massive support packages. Okay, so these were my remarks. So this is a very high quality paper with high quality micro evidence that we can all benefit from on one of the main policy debates. I think it would be interesting to kind of try to reconcile the micro evidence with some more macro evidence in future work. And this would allow for a more full-blown evaluation of the social costs and benefits of these sort of policies.
Okay, thank you. Vincent, why don't you stay up here? And Philippe and Lionel also. So I will open up for some questions. I will also give you a chance to comment. And I also want to feed in a few comments along the lines of Vincent, but maybe with another angle, going from micro to macro and then to understanding the markets and the implications for that. So I was not fully understanding how you can take the micro evidence. So those are reactions given that the other firms are not affected. So in particular, when you have the competitiveness implications, that would be different if everyone is changing prices at the same time. I could explain, I guess, why the implications for unemployment are smaller in the macro than in the micro. But on the other hand, and this goes to the policy things, you build on the assumption, or it seems to be a fact, that in France many firms have long contracts. So not all firms would have been affected by price changes. Is that really true? Or if they had long contracts, didn't the energy firms try to renegotiate the contracts, compensate for having new contracts, etc.? And I don't really, it's surprising that you can get so much energy savings if few firms are affected by price changes. So how did you obtain market clearing? In Sweden, I don't know, but my feeling is that, or I think pretty sure that all manufacturing firms have an electricity price that is set by the hour. And it's more and more common that also households have a price that changes by the hour. And that's intentional to get energy efficiency. So the policy recommendation to have more long contracts, I see the point in having a smoother price and more predictable, but how do we get the market to clear? So do you want to respond to briefly to what you think is most pressing here? And so we have time also to take some other questions.
I can start. So thanks a lot for the discussions. They are super useful, and I'm sure we're going to take on board a lot of the suggestions you've made in terms of the structure of the paper. I think that what Julien was proposing, I think, is super useful, and I agree we have to make a better job. And in some sense, it's also related to your comment on the micro-macro connection. But in a sense, maybe we should be modest here. This is a micro paper, okay? What we want to try to convince you, so we're not going to try to build it as a macro paper. What we're trying to convince you is that the channels at the micro level that we were observing during the past period are still instructive in trying to understand how firms did react during this crisis. So we're not trying to just replicate the macro level. One point on this, on the macro, your 5 million jobs. So don't worry. Indeed, there are no 5 million jobs lost in our paper.
Sorry.
Basically,
can I interrupt a second? There is some subtitling in the TV that is coming up, and if that goes live stream, I don't know what's happening there. Okay. Okay.
Where was I?
There were not 5 million.
Yeah. No 5 million jobs lost. Yeah. And the reason is that remember that the elasticities that we find are smaller for large shocks, and maybe more important for employment. As time goes on the latest period, what we find is that actually French manufacturing firms are relatively immune in terms of, or less, dependent on energy price shocks at the end of the period than at the beginning of the period. So basically, that's the reason why more or less we find -5% on employment, which is more or less what has happened on the manufacturing sector if you in France for production. Sorry. Okay. So again, maybe we should not try we're not trying to replicate the macro story. We're just saying the numbers we're getting are not completely foolish in terms of the macro story. One thing that also in terms of competitiveness, because I think it was said, is that it's still true that the impact on competitiveness is important, and it's true. So here, this is a clear difference between a firm level shock and an aggregate shock that we've seen, because all firms basically in Europe have suffered from the energy shock. It's still true that there was some heterogeneity. Even in France, some manufacturing firms actually, so it's maybe different in Sweden, but in France, some manufacturing firms, because they had long-term contracts, basically had no or very little increase in their price of energy. They will have it certainly in 2023, maybe, but actually there was a lot of heterogeneity. Again, maybe the institutional framework in Sweden is different. And this competitiveness effect is quite big, because basically, I haven't talked about it, but basically to compensate the energy price increase in terms of the export impact, 10% to compensate a 10% increase in the price of electricity, you would need a 7% depreciation of the euro. So this is pretty large. This is very large. Lionel, you want to?
So yeah, maybe if I can add one or two things, because most of the things have been said. So thanks a lot again for the very insightful and helpful comments. So Julien did, with Greek letters what we had in mind and the kind of back of envelope calculations that we just shown. So this is very helpful. So on the question of whether we should consider the overall energy dependency, so cumulating what you consume in terms of electricity and what you consume in terms of gas, this is something that we somehow resisted to because, as I said at the beginning, not all firms are using gas and electricity. And so what we want to have is really the reaction to the change in the price of electricity and with the change of the price of gas. So anyway, this is something we tried. So as you can imagine, we have a bunch of estimations that have been presented. And in some of them, we combine the two, electricity and gas, to see how things change, etc. So this is something that we can easily add to the paper. So one element which is very important and that we don't discuss in the paper for the moment is whether energy savings are permanent or not. And so what we have been looking at in the paper is simply the positive variation in the electricity price, for instance, and the negative variation in the electricity price. And what you see also is that when the price of electricity or gas is going down, then you have a huge expansion of the demand for electricity or gas. And so meaning that, the efficiency that you can observe at a given point in time can reverse if the price goes down very fast. And this is something which we should look at more systematically. But this asymmetry and the fact that you react somehow wrongly to the drop in the price of electricity, you consume more of electricity, is something which is in the data. So two small points to make sure that what we said was clear, and maybe I went too fast on this. So what we don't observe is the contract that has been signed by the firm or by the plants. So this you do not observe. And so it might be interesting. We have overall evidence. So there has been a survey by INSEE recently just to know what is the proportion of long-term contracts, short-term contracts, etc., for the different type of firms in manufacturing, in services. And indeed, what we see, and this is in the paper, is that a big chunk of firms have long-term contracts. Then you have also small firms that have regulated price, so the regulated price don't change. So you have also a mix of market price, regulated price. For a given firm, you can have a combination of the two, given that you have different plants. But this is not something that we observe. We would love to observe this, to have the detail of the contracts signed by the firms, but this is indeed something which is not available to us, at least. So I'm pretty sure that someone at the INSEE can look at it, but we didn't manage to put our hands on this data. And so we cannot go much further than this. And so this is true that, French firms have been somehow protected by the fact that they sign long-term contracts at a given point in time, but some of them had to renew their contracts, like in 2023, we will have half of the firms that will have manufacturing firms that will have to renegotiate their contracts. So this is the sort of thing. But we don't observe all these details. What we just observe is the bill that you pay and how much you consume. And so this is the best that we can do. And on the calculation, you already answered, Philippe. So what we consider is the, for instance, for electricity, is the elasticity that is, calculated for the largest increase at the end of the period. So when we combine the two criterion, so the importance of the tariff hike and the period. And then when you do that, the price elasticity of demand, for instance, is very low. This is like 0.15. So
but it's not zero.
It's not zero, but
Okay,
it's
so
much better.
let's, time is running here, and I see quite a lot of potential interventions. So let's collect a few comments or questions, and Hannes has been eager for a long time, I think.
Thank you so much. I'm actually quite eager to ask this question. So have you thought about transitory versus permanent price shocks? Because that seems to me really important. I mean, both in this discussion about long-term contracts and the short-term contracts, but also like the reaction that we see towards what's happening right now. Do people believe this is like the new equilibrium price? Do they believe that this will come back down, right? Or like, because that will completely determine how firms react, right? And then how much can you extrapolate from your findings to other situations? And I think that therefore thinking about the permanence of these price changes is really important.
Okay, so let's take a few more. Emilia was early on also, I think.
Yes. Great paper, by the way. I wanted just to make a point about whether you would like to exploit private investment in green technologies, like what is the role of that, like in the decrease of the elasticities and over time, for example. So I've been working with data on Italy, and there private firms have been investing a lot, like in solar panels and these kinds of things, but also public investments could also, like to the extent that they end up in the mix of energy. And one idea would be to exploit regional differences in the adoption of these technologies to see whether you find some patterns there.
Giacomo?
Yes, thank you so much. This is so interesting. So there's a couple of things I wanted to point out, and then others that I'm not going to point out. So one thing is, to me, if I understand correctly, the contracting of energy prices depends on quantities directly, right? Because time of the day, but also quantities directly affect the price, right? When you contract, the first whatever number of kilowatts, and will give a price, and then, so that basically tells me already that there's a gigantic nonlinearity in what you're finding in kinks in the budgets. And so maybe you could exploit some sort of more quantile version of this, because you have firm fixed effects, right? But firm fixed effects do not deal with that, because what you want to know is the heterogeneity across, because these jumps in prices will be very different according to how much you're consuming. Typically, this pricing is highly nonlinear, so it's actually as kinks. It's not even just nonlinear, it's actually has discontinuities. And so that is part that maybe you can figure out because the contracting agreement are there. And so let's say quantiles could be some stuff that you could do. There's better things that one can do, but then there's another question that I think is maybe more interesting in a way. So how do they achieve more efficiency? So why didn't they do it before? Is it a fixed cost? That actually relates to Anna's question. So is it, what is it? Because if I know I can be very efficient on energy, why am I not doing it before? And probably it's because there's a big upfront fixed cost. But if the price is just a shock, then low price movements are not the right elasticity to be estimated, right? Because typically, I guess, energy prices have I1 or I2 series, maybe, I don't know who knows this stuff. And so that means that essentially that this is going to be permanent forever. It's not, it's a white noise process, right? It's an unknown walk. So now you know that tomorrow the price is going to be today plus an error. And so that is very different from a price shock where you are rebounding back, which basically means that should I actually pay the upfront fixed cost to do the transition if I know that the price tomorrow is going to be going down? And so these are important stuff in the elasticities, I think.
Moritz.
Thank you. I wanted to ask slightly, I don't know, there was this thing with the global financial crisis when the Queen asked, how did this happen? And we did not see this. And like revisiting the debate over the last year, we had a large part of our profession being convinced that these elasticities would be zero in the short term. So where did we go wrong? How did you, is this just like the lobby power of companies that protected their profits in the end, or what is, how could we go so wrong? Why did we need to have this debate?
Okay, do you want to comment? So I don't expect you to try to comment on everything, and then you can also jump in if you want to, Vincent, or Julian also, if you have something.
Maybe I can start with the last question. So of course we have in mind and we cite the what if paper and the debate that took place a bit more than a year ago, especially in Germany. Remember in that paper, you know it very well, of course, is that even with a small elasticity, the macro implications are small. So at the end, our elasticities, if we take the large shocks at the end, so if we're super conservative, the elasticity of demand is going to be relatively small, but still it's going to be significant, and there it's going to be around 0.15. And so 0.15 is not huge, but it's enough in that indeed it's going to enable firms to adjust. And it's true that I think what we identify is the fact that there are many channels. So why this debate? It's more a political economy thing. Is that you were in Germany? You were in France, but you followed the German debate. I think yes, indeed, in France, I've seen it. Firms, manufacturing firms, went to the Ministry of Finance, of the Economy, and said, "We're gonna die. We're gonna die." But exactly like, because I lived through it as an economic advisor, like during COVID, restaurants in France went to say 50% of the restaurants are going to disappear. And we put enormous amounts of money on restaurants. At the end of COVID, restaurants were in better financial shape than before. Much better. So yes, so indeed, I mean, the political economy is very important. But to be completely honest and fair, remember that at the end, there was a lot of price absorption. So it's not as if the public policy was let the market completely free, and because otherwise we would have had maybe much larger price increases and maybe much larger drops in employment and production. Still, at the firm level, in France, for example, the price of electricity went up quite a lot. I think it was something like 50%.
Yes, just to complement on the quantile regression, yes, this is a good idea. Actually, we tried this at some point, and I cannot even recall why we didn't put this in the paper. There must be a good reason. More importantly, the question of why is it that firms did not do that before? If there was, a low-hanging fruit, in terms of saving energy, why is it that they didn't do that? So this is just about rational inattention. And so when the price of energy is rather low, if I go back to the share of energy in the cost of the firm, so when it is just a couple of percent for most of the firms, so they don't really care about it, and so the first thing that firms, and this is a discussion that we have had with a representative of firms. So the first thing that they do when the price of electricity is increasing is just shutting down the light when they leave their office, as we all do at home. So this is just as stupid as this, or they turn off the computer, etc. And so this is just efficiency. And efficiency, as we define it, maybe defined somehow loosely, because we said that when you substitute one plant for another, this is already efficiency. When you import instead of producing by yourself, by definition, in what we do, this is also efficiency. But this is kind of a loose acception of the terms efficiency. But this is not just about the fixed cost of doing things. This is just about the rational intention.
If I can just complement on this, I think, I mean, so I'm not sure we have firm level data on investment, but basically, I mean, if the price is large enough, some investments that were not profitable are going to become profitable. I think it's as simple as this. And it's still true that if you look at this, it looks as if indeed French firms did some investment to increase energy efficiency. So it seems as if that indeed during this whole period, they have invested in energy efficiency. So maybe they are going one step further in doing even more investment into energy efficiency because of the crisis. And so it relates to the other question, which is it transitory or permanent, which I think is a great question, and I think we should try to look at this more in detail. We have looked at regressions where we have lags, actually, and so what we see is that it does not reverse. It's not, so it dies down. So the first effect in period T+1 is very large, period T+2 is a bit smaller, but it's not as if in period T-5 it's negative. It goes to zero, basically. But I think we should, so I really agree that we should do more on that, on the dynamics of the impact.
Okay, so two final interventions, and I think we can continue discussing over dinner also, so we have plenty of time. So Arnold.
But if I can be sure, and in a way, Philippe, you already answered to my question. I mean, I was thinking of what's different in 2022 relative to the sample period, which stopped in 2019, so before the whatever it costs, no doctrine. So my question is, were there massive fiscal intervention in support of firms in the face of energy shocks in the sample, or is this something which was completely new in 2020?
Investment?
Of fiscal interventions, no, in support of firms. Firms coming to Bercy and saying, I'm going to die, so give me money. Did this happen before?
Just a quick on the options for fiscal policy. We had in 73 an oil shock. We didn't know whether it would be permanent or not, but in the end, it changed unemployment rates and inflation for decades. I mean, in France, we haven't yet recovered the unemployment rate of before through all sorts of mechanisms, hysteresis kind of things. So it made a lot of sense for governments to intervene this time and try to avoid the unemployment and inflation shock. If you look at the difference between your two extreme countries, the Netherlands and France, inflation in Netherlands, I think, went to something like 10%. In France, it capped at 5%, which is important by the way, within the European Union, where monetary union, where we don't have interest rates, France has an advantage, a permanent price comparative advantage vis-a-vis Germany or Netherlands and so on and so forth. So these things were important. Now, you had this option 1 and option 2, and clearly why I fully agree with you is that giving money to everyone was a mistake. They should have given money on the margin to countries so they could go to firms so they could adapt the thing, but giving a big chunk to large corporations that were doing very well and could always absorb the shock was a mistake. But then you explained to us what happened in the hallways of Bercy, and that's why the policy mistakes have been wrong, and not just in Paris, of course.
Monica also, that's the final intervention, and then we...
I was wondering how you, I was wondering how you deal with multi-product firms. And could part of the efficiency effect come from the fact that multi-product firms, when the cost of energy goes up, they drop the products that are further from their core competence, in which they are less energy efficient?
So we didn't look at that, but it's a great thing. We can look at it actually through the exports. We could look if they drop some. So I think we should look at that.
But we did not, because then this is
100 pages, and then the editors are going to say, cut, cut, cut. So maybe for another paper, but yeah.
No, maybe on the policy debate, I think that we have to be even clearer on what we said, and this comes back to your discussion. So you said at some point that we were just saying that stop burning money. Huh? This is not exactly what we said. So at some point there was kind of emergency, and as Charles said, so there was a necessity to intervene somehow and to burn some money at some point. But the question is much more how we get out of this trap when we subsidize, the use of energy, and maybe we then miss energy efficiency that could be achieved without, subsidizing so much the use of energy. And so the question, which is very much in the air in France, but I guess everywhere in Europe, is how do we get out of this? How do we stop, the system? Which, future can we envisage in terms of, the organization of the electricity market, the relation between the price of gas and the price of electricity, which is the current debate. So I think this is much more in this direction that our results should be read.
Yeah, and in a sense, the message is that it's not that we're against interventions with public money. Is that the way we spend the public money is very important, and I have nothing against subsidizing innovation to some extent, of course, the innovation and decarbonation of firms, helping industry to go in that direction. But I prefer to spend money in that rather than absorbing the price shock. But still the short-term response is important to think of, because we know that in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, we may have another energy price shock, and therefore we have to think about the two policy legs. The one which is the very short-term absorption. How do we best do it without spending too much money and without sending too much of the wrong price signals, and the long-term leg of public policy, which is basically the structure of the energy market in Europe, and trying to help firms to use less gas and electricity.
Okay, thank you. Did you have some final thoughts, Vincent?
No, thanks
Okay,
for your
okay.
thanks for your reply. No, I think I fully agree with you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
So
so much
we
for the
stop with that,
comments.
and maybe there is some announcements about dinner, or do you need information? We close the session first. Yes. So thank you very much for all your questions and for your presentation. Thank you.